This is episode 53 of the Fire Protection Podcast, powered by Inspect Point. This month is October Fire Prevention Month, Fire Safety Month, 2023. I've always wanted to do this, but wanted to have a children's book author on the podcast regarding fire safety. I've been through a lot of books. My marketing, Joanne, and the whole team has been through a lot of different books, and I actually found one. So Ken Korber joins me on the podcast today to talk about his book, Grace and Friends. It's a book, more of an activity book, but it gets into different types of fires. It gets into burn prevention, uh, fire classification, and extinguisher evac plans for your house, and talking to your kids about how to get out of the house. So, you see a lot of children's books about, whether it's Pete the Cat or uh, Paw Patrol, obviously firefighter and oriented, visiting the firehouse. But this is actually geared toward fire prevention and all the different aspects we see. I thought it was a really cool book, and got chatting with Ken about it. He's going to have a second edition of this too, and I actually myself and Inspect Point will be involved in some of that. So really cool to talk to Ken. And Paul Possenti is also a co-author. He's a head of the burn center at Yale New Haven Health in Bridgeport, overseeing their burn center. So it's really cool to see kind of Ken produce this book, obviously with burn prevention in mind, but also fire safety in mind. So real good, feel good episode this month for episode 53. You can find the book. I'll share it in the link. I'll also throw it up here for the YouTube as well. It's Grace and Friends, and you can find it on Amazon or anywhere you find books, I guess. So on to the podcast. And again, thanks for Ken for joining the podcast. All right, here we go. Thanks, Ken, for joining the Fire Protection Podcast with me today. This early part of October, Fire Prevention Month. So I'm glad to have you on.
Happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. So we've been wanting to do this for a while. We try to do something in Fire Awareness Month, or Fire Safety Awareness Month, whatever you want to, Prevention Month, which is October. And I've always wanted to talk about a children's book, right? Because there's a lot of information. How do young kids get a lot of fire safety information? The firefighters come into the schools a lot when they're young.
Right.
But a lot of times it's through books. And Joanne on my marketing side, found you and sent me this nice book here, which, well, you can't really see it because of my blurred background. But you know what? I'll share my screen so everybody can see it. So it's Grace and Friends by Ken Korber and Paul Possenti. And yeah, it was really cool. It kind of gets into the details of, I'll let you explain it here in a second, but it was super specific to our fire protection and fire prevention industry. So it was awesome to kind of read it, and I actually read it to my boys, and they absolutely loved it. So Ken, tell us a little bit more about you as an author.
So this whole children's book thing was really a second career pivot for me. I'm clinically trained as a physician assistant. I worked in surgery. I worked in cardiology for years. The reason Paul's on the cover with me is he's a classmate. So we went to school together, and he is actually the burn director for Bridgeport Hospital, and he's also part of the Yale New Haven Health System in terms of trauma care and burn care. So we got together and we said, oh, we should probably do a book that's not a storytelling adventure for kids about burns and fire safety in the home, because there's really nothing out there. So we tried to fill a gap, educational gap and unmet need within the industry. And Grace and Friends activity book came from that as a first edition. And I used my storybook characters from my Musical Adventures of Grace series as sort of the narrators or the spokespeople for an audience of 3 to 6 year olds about burn prevention and fire safety, because the adult conversations don't make sense to them. The big 3-syllable words and all that stuff. But if they can have a character that can resonate and give the key messages, they are engaged with that sort of a model for, and they're learning how to read at the same time. So there's a win-win.
Right. Yeah, there's some really cool stuff in the book on, it's not just it's definitely a story and they engage in it. I asked my boys, we read it over the weekend, and I was like, "Hey, why did you like this book?" And I was like, "Oh, it's an activity book. They get to do mazes. There's puzzles in there. Um, there's one part of the book where it's the floor plan of putting your floor plan and your escape plan out of the house, which, I've been trying to do that and putting that together because, it's part of fire safety, but it kind
Right,
of embeds it right into the book. So you kind of have to do it to complete the book, right?
right, right. Yeah, and the whole thing, the whole reason we picked the subject was that there's about 3,000 unnecessary deaths every year that happens, adults and children, and then of those 3,000, it's like 500 are kids. So we thought, if we can prevent one of those, that would be sort of worth having the book out there as as a tool, as a resource for parents or for people in general. So that's kind of our driving motivation to kind of put it all together.
Yeah, I mean, especially for parents, I think it would be good because as they read it, there's some stuff on classification of extinguishers in there, which uh, unless you're somebody in fire prevention or fire protection or a firefighter, a lot of times you don't know what an ABC or you know uh, an A fire is versus an E fire, and I had to actually rack my brain a little bit to remember some of it, and it was good. It's great for adults, obviously great for kids too.
Yeah, I mean, just explaining in a snapshot that you use this fire extinguisher for this kind of fire versus this fire extinguisher for this other kind of fire is useful because sometimes it makes the fires worse if you're using the wrong extinguisher, right? So
Yeah, yeah,
it's
especially on the grease fires, and
yeah,
you know,
exactly. Yeah.
just cover it. Just cover it.
That's right. Put the blanket. That's right.
Yeah. So where did the idea come from? Was you and Paul just coming up with it, or is it obviously you said it fit a need?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted so the musical Adventures of Grace series is really the sort of the commercial version of reading music and health. Between my covers of my stories, I'm the only author that kind of does that. There are plenty of books out there that do individually, music stories and health stories and reading stories with characters. But that's how I got a publisher. So I'm sort of in a niche kind of place where I can combine the three types of features or domains into the stories at the same time. So it kind of makes it a little more interesting. So that was sort of the basis for developing the character. I have like 8 characters from that series. So I said, well, how can I use my healthcare background as kind of a way to kind of bridge that now that I have these musically centric characters that are talking about playing saxophones and practicing
Yeah.
drums and all that stuff. So I said, oh, let's do public health kinds of things or anything related to pediatrics or kids care, because you get that as part of your training as a PA. So um, I said, oh well, let's if we do burns, then that would be very specific and very targeted and very educationally centric. So then I said, who do I know in burns? And I said, oh my God, that's Paul's that's Paul's domain in Connecticut.
Yeah.
So Paul and I got together and we said, I use him whenever I co-author books. I use my co-author as sort of the subject matter expert, and Paul was like the perfect person for that because he's been in trauma care and burn care
Yep.
for years in Bridgeport Hospital and the Yale New Haven system. And I've had burn care in my background, but just in a smaller sort of sample size from the ICU that I used to work in. But so we got together. We said, what do we need to, what are some of the things we can do for kids? And we came up with this activity book idea. And then we said, okay, let's kind of pull this all together using key concepts about burn prevention and fire safety, especially in the homes,
Mhm.
because that's where all the disasters and catastrophes are happening, right? So
Yeah.
that's kind of what our target is.
No, it was good. It was great. Some of the information
Yeah,
on just the classification of burns, right? Where
yeah,
I
yeah,
kind of knew it, but the public doesn't know that sometimes.
and thankfully we've gotten pretty good feedback and some testimonials about the first story or first book And we're creating a second edition now, which is actually going to be probably twice the size of the first one. And we're going to have more burn stuff in there. We're going to have more activities for the kids, like coloring, and they can cut out a page with puzzle pieces and put the puzzle together and stuff like that, as kind of just things to kind of make it stick in their brains in terms of what we're trying to teach them about burns and fires.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember, just being a kid growing up, the only thing that really resonated was the stop, drop, and roll,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Which is the fire's
Right.
already happening at that point. And, this is just prevention, and you even get into like, the top 10 types of fires that happen in the home, right? And I actually didn't know some of the data. So you guys were bringing data in from NFPA, who we work with NFPA in our industry pretty heavily, and obviously they do a lot of the prevention stuff on the residential side too. So
Yeah, and we can always use those little marketing tidbits that say 144 minutes. There's a fire related death in the country, kind of a thing, to kind of really hit people over the head with sort of how serious an issue it is. Um, and that's kind of what we're going to showcase in the new editions. All these little bits of information that the parents can use and put together from the adult side, and then the kids will have fun doing all the little games associated with
yeah,
those.
yeah. No, it's great. I'm looking forward to that. Um, yeah, one of the I think we were talking about before we started going live here is just like, some of the fires, obviously kitchens and cooking's number
Yeah.
one, but I know personally, 3 or 4 people that have had house fires because of lithium ion battery fires. And it's a big problem, within the society right now. Is like, electric batteries are here to stay. They're going to continue. How do we make the home safe? Um, I know people that won't even buy a Tesla because of the potential dangers
Mm,
of it, right?
mm.
So, and 2 of the house fires I know are cordless batteries just being left plugged in. So,
Wow.
once they're charged, turn it off. A lot of the battery, like even my kids' toys, have lithium ion little, batteries in them. Get them unplugged. You don't know where they're manufactured. Um, Make sure you're monitoring it, because again, personally, I've known 3 or 4 people. Uh, and obviously there's a fire a day in New York City because of lithium ion battery fires.
Wow.
Oh
Well, I'm
wow.
going to steal that idea,
Yeah, please do.
Drew. Put that in the second book. Yeah, I mean,
Um,
there's so much out there in terms of what people need to know about prevention and safety. It's a
what
lot.
I saw is there any other books that you put out? You had one on, it looks like stroke prevention, right? That was interesting.
Yeah, so that's so with that whole idea of how do I bridge my background with this new career kind of a thing of being a children's book author. Any topic that's related to kids is fair game in terms
Yeah.
of putting together a story with the characters and having the characters tell interesting things to the readers as they're learning how to read. So the stroke awareness book is the first one in the country, I think, certainly U.S., where it's co-authored by a friend of mine who's a stroke survivor, who is also a radio broadcast guy. So
Oh wow.
he interviewed me years ago, and then he unfortunately had a stroke, but he seems to have recovered pretty well from it. So he's back to the broadcasting biz that he was in. He does podcasts and was on the radio and all that. Anyway, so Bill and I put together this story about Grace, who has an aunt who makes the best pizza, and her aunt starts having signs and symptoms of a stroke because she's elderly, and Grace doesn't know, what she can do. So we sort of build in this whole idea of what are the signs and symptoms of stroke from the adults in terms of what they know about, about fast and frequency and falling and weakness and slurred speech and all that, time to call 911. So they have that acronym out there, be fast. And we said, okay, let's show kids about be fast. So then the way we framed that was Grace, as the character, becomes a superhero because she's aware of how to recognize signs and symptoms of stroke for older relatives or
Yep.
people around her. Um, and that's kind of how we introduced it to a 6-year-old who doesn't know what the adults are talking about when they say
Right.
stroke. So it was a nice little news story that has sort of a clinical message to it, which was my background, and then Bill's world experience on how we should position different conversations and what the stroke victim is kind of dealing with at the time that they're having conversations and stuff, because he actually went through that himself.
Yeah.
So we kind of make it real world. And we put out a little blurb that says that it's going to be available after World Stroke Day, which is here in October. And we're going to see the American Heart Association is interested in sponsoring it by giving us a grant, educational grant, and then they're going to buy like 1,000 copies and send it
Oh,
out to all
nice.
the doctors that are part of the American Heart Association, so they can put it in their waiting rooms and stuff like that. So we're gonna kind of spread the word about stroke awareness for kids, and then do it in a way that's fun. You know,
Yeah.
learning how to make pizza, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I think this, and back to the fire safety book, you make it fun. And it was like, I asked kids, right? I asked my boys, and they said, "Hey, I like this book because I can have fun with it, right?" And it's an activity book, and um, they're gonna retain it. I'm sure a lot better.
and the great thing about kids is that, as you know, as being a dad and me being a dad, that the kids at that age are so curious about stuff.
Yeah.
So, that's what time sometimes gets them in trouble, right? Is messing around in the kitchen and turning the knobs when they shouldn't be turning the knobs on the stove and
Right.
all that stuff. And just because they're curious about life around them. So when you kind of give them a story that sort of resonates with a character who's the same age as them or close to it, it's fun as opposed to
Yep.
trying to get something that's coming down from an adult in the house who has to then translate it into kid language.
Yeah.
It's almost like trying to translate medical words into sort of plain language for patients. It's the same sort of thing for parents. They got to make it relevant to what the kids understand. So that's kind of how we do. We try to translate all these little stories.
No, it was a lot of fun, and we haven't done all the activities yet, but we'll get to them. And I'm gonna, my team at Inspect Point, we're gonna send a bunch of copies out to the kids and stuff, and yeah, should be a lot of fun, and great way to kick off fire safety awareness month in October. So,
Yeah, yeah, for
uh,
sure.
Ken, where can we find you? I'm gonna while you're saying that, I'm gonna put the website back up on the screen. But where can we find the book?
So two ways that are probably the easiest. Eckertspress.com, ECKHARTZ press, PRESS.com is my publisher. They have, a whole website where all the authors are listed with all the books that you can learn information about that. I have my own website, littlehealthambassadors.com. No spaces, just, 3 words together, where they can get the books directly. If they order the books on Little Health Ambassadors, we send out autographed copies of each of the books that are sold on the website. Um, and we can answer any questions that people have by the email hello@littlehealthambassadors.com. So it's pretty straightforward. Or you can Google us, Google me, Google Grace and Friends, Musical Adventures of Grace. You can Google and see all the books there as well.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you coming on today again, and yeah, we'll get this out here soon, and look forward to see the feedback. I think it's gonna be very positive feedback from the fire protection community, because I haven't found anything out there in the couple years doing this. So
Excellent. No, thank you. We totally appreciate this. To get the word out is important, right?
yeah,
So,
yeah, you gotta get the word out, and especially the little guys. So
yep.
all right, thanks
Thanks,
again, Ken.
Drew.
Yep.
Thanks.
Take care. Want to thank Ken Korber again for joining the podcast to discuss Grace and Friends, his children's book and activity book. Really cool to see that and kind of highlight that in Fire Prevention Month here in October. So we'll put all the links out there. Please, it's a very reasonable price of $15 on his website. We're going to buy a bunch of copies for our team and anybody interested as well. So uh, make sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you again here soon. Thanks.